What's up, folks? Welcome back to the Whoop Podcast, where we sit down with the top athletes, scientists, experts, and more. Learn what the best in the world are doing and learn what you can do to perform your best. All right, Whoop is on a mission to unlock human performance. I'm your host, Will Ahmed, founder and CEO of Whoop. And this week, we got a great episode. We're going to go deep on sleep debt and how sleep deprivation affects your body. But first, a reminder, you can use the code WILL, W-I-L-L, get 15% off a Whoop membership. Actually have a tool that really accurately measures sleep, among other things, recovery, exercise, the health monitor, bunch of great features. Check that out, whoop.com, use the code WILL. Our VP of Performance, fearless leader, Kristen Holmes, is back and joined by sleep expert, Dr. Allison Brager. Dr. Brager is a neurobiologist and a major with the United States Army, and her research has covered survival in extreme environments under sleep deprivation and stress. So those of you who think you work a little too much and have trouble sleeping, these are going to be some extreme environments that we're talking about. She sits on fatigue management and neuroenhancement working groups for NATO, the Office of the Army Surgeon General, and a variety of government agencies, including the Department of Defense and NASA. She's also a member of the Whoop Women's Performance Collective. Kristen and Dr. Brager discuss how to understand sleep debt and sleep need, groundbreaking Whoop research about how sleep debt affects our next day cognitive functioning, what we know about banking sleep before anticipated periods of less sleep, why fragmented sleep can have such a negative effect on us, and everything you need to know about caffeine and how it impacts the chemicals in your body. This is a fun one. It's a really good one if you're into sleep. And without further ado, here are Kristen and Dr. Brager.
Dr. Allison Brager is a neurobiologist with expertise in sleep and circadian rhythms for the United States Army. Her work examines the substrates and mechanism of resiliency to extreme environmental stress, including exercise, jet lag, and sleep deprivation. Dr. Brager has over 30 peer-reviewed publications in flagship journals and is the author of a very popular science book entitled Meathead: Unraveling the Athletic Brain. And by the way, no big deal, a two-time CrossFit Games and regional competitor. Phew, Allison, welcome.
Oh, it's so great to be here. I'm just so stoked to talk about sleep, especially since it's Sleep Awareness Month.
Exactly. Yeah, it's very topical, and just being able to leverage your expertise in kind of all things sleep is going to be really cool. And I'm excited to kind of tap in particularly to sleep deprivation and really try to help folks understand exactly what that is, what it looks like. And I think most importantly, the strategies and tools to kind of break the cycle of sleep debt. You know, as we know, our world isn't really set up to kind of facilitate optimal sleep. So, you know, it's I think something that we have to really develop boundaries and skills around, and can't wait to get your perspective on all of that. You know, obviously as a soldier, and you know, you've experienced firsthand the conditions of sleep deprivation, and obviously as a scientist, you've been able to research the effects of sleep debt. Maybe start by just kind of outlining, you know, what is this phenomena of sleep debt, and maybe how it's different from poor sleep.
Okay, so sleep debt is different than poor sleep because sleep debt is basically poor sleep accrued over time. You've heard this analogy before. We think of sleep as a bank account. And so the more you take out, the more you have to repay. Now, you can actually bank on sleep. And we know that phenomenon works because we have done countless studies at Walter Reed to show that loading up on sleep prior to anticipated sleep deprivation improves cognitive, emotional, and even such things as pain tolerance. So that is like how we think of the relationship of sleep debt. Now, poor sleep is a component of sleep debt. So poor sleep can be a single night of sleep deprivation or of poor, fragmented, unconsolidated sleep. So obviously a Whoop score that is in the red. But then you can also have poor sleep where you consistently have scores in the red, even if you're doing all the right things, such as sleep coaching, hydration, nutrition, etc. But yeah, sleep debt is the biggest problem. So that's like the macroscopic problem, and poor sleep is an element of sleep debt.
Got it.
If that makes sense.
It does, yep. Now that we kind of have an understanding of just, all right, what is sleep debt, let's talk a little bit about set points and just how everyone has kind of a different sleep need, and then we can kind of back into some of the components of sleep deprivation. But I think that it's important for everyone just to understand that we don't all need to spend the same amount of time in bed, and kind of what influences that, and what do you know about it based on your research?
Yeah, that is an excellent question, and that's one I get asked a lot. So obviously the recommendations of the American Academy of Sleep Medicine and the National Sleep Foundation is between 7 and 9 hours per night. And the reason that is because the international average of sleep need is 8.4 hours. That is something that has been determined through years and years of anthropological and very large-scale epidemiological studies of sleep in different cultures. So it's not just factoring in how Americans sleep, it's Europeans and even like tribal communities in sub-Saharan Africa. Like 8.4 is the human biological need for sleep. But there's a huge standard deviation and standard error with that. And we know that especially when we look at high performers in society. So historically, if you look at the US presidents, most of them are short sleepers. Bill Clinton is probably the most famous president who only needed about 3 or 4 hours per sleep per night. President Obama was similar. Same with CEOs and executives. I used to think when I first heard about how little Elon Musk slept, at first I was like, well, that explains some of his other behaviors. But then I started to realize it's like, no, there actually are a handful of corporate executives who have essentially self-selected because of being short sleepers, which is a rare genetic mutation. That's what I like to emphasize. It is
Yes.
because of a rare genetic mutation of a gene called DEC2, DEC2, that they are able to do that. But most of the population falls within the bell curve in normal distribution of needing 8.4 hours per sleep per night. And unfortunate people are in the far other tail of the distribution where they need 10 to 11 hours of sleep per night. It's called hypersomnia, and it sucks for them, but unfortunately their genetic programming has wired them that way.
Yeah, that's an incredible explanation. And I think it's, because I think these leaders are obviously so visible and their sleep habits are talked about, people think that that's okay. I can adopt that lifestyle as well. But I think to your point is a very important one, that this is a very small percentage of the population have this gene. And in fact, folks are being pre-selected into these fields, that actually require less sleep at night, which is, I think I've never actually heard that point made. So I think that's really interesting.
Yeah. I mean, quite honestly, and I've told soldiers this before, generals, they're the same way, where they pre-select as short sleepers and then also early morning people. I am a vampire. My parents are vampires, and I need 8 hours. So I will never have any hopes and dreams of ever being anyone important at that level in the military because my genetic programming does not conform with that. And if I tried, I would probably get sick.
So just as it relates to kind of the Whoop platform, we have what's called a sleep need algorithm that basically tells you, based on a whole bunch of different factors, how much time you actually need to be spending in bed. The algorithm looks at your baseline sleep need. It looks at sleep that you've accumulated. It looks at your day strain. It looks at any naps you might have taken. And then basically we give you a sleep need recommendation. I remember we were talking about these recommendations, and a lot of sleep scientists push back on this sleep need recommendation for, it's a black box, it's an algorithm, it's proprietary, we don't share it. But one of the kind of my personal missions, it just seems really on point in terms of, when I listen to Whoop sleep need recommendations, like I fare much better. And that goes for, I'm not good if I spend too much time in bed. So if I oversleep, I end up with a poorer recovery the next day. So, it just, the N of 1 and all the data that I was, I've been exposed to, it just seemed to really prove to be, valid, these recommendations. So we did a study in collaboration with the University of Queensland, University of Melbourne, and we looked at basically the influence of sleep, stress, and HRV on cognitive control. And one of the kind of happy findings of the study is we saw that with individuals who accumulated 45 minutes of sleep debt, they had a 5 to 10% decrease on next day executive function and cognitive control. It was just like this really happy finding in that it kind of validated, kind of in a backdoor way, validated these sleep need recommendations, because we saw on these cognitive control tasks, we saw, very clearly decrements in kind of these cognitive tasks. So it was kind of an interesting, so just love to get your thoughts on that.
Well, I'm sure, let me ask you this first. Was it an exponential relationship, and that if the greater the delta between sleep need and actual sleep reported, there was greater cognitive?
Yeah. So that was just, at 45 minutes, we saw 5 to 10. And then at 90 minutes, we saw greater, it wasn't a perfect exponential relationship in the sense that it wasn't 5%, let's say at 45 minutes. And then at 90 minutes, it was 10%. It wasn't like that, but we would see 11% decline in some individuals. But so it was definitely, there would be a deleterious effect, an increasing deleterious effect, the more sleep that you accumulated.
Nope, I'm not surprised at all. So that actually mirrors the findings that we found out in the operational environment when we're looking at sleep amounts and combat effectiveness. So the Army has actually been doing this since the Gulf War. I don't know if you know this. The Army developed the first ActiWatch back in the 90s. Now retired Colonel Greg Belinkie, wonderful, huge contributor in the sleep field. And he's really the reason why I came to Walter Reed, is because I wanted to carry on this legacy that Greg built. And he found direct relationships between total sleep time, downrange, and next day military performance. And when I was deployed 4 years ago, and we did a similar study with the 1st Armored Division back down in Kuwait, we found very similar results where however much sleep they had 24 hours prior mirrored how they performed on marksmanship activities with Abrams tanks. So wow. It's not a surprise, and I think it's very similar to what we see in the lab, like the classic lab studies where they use the psychomotor vigilance test, which is a test of reaction time, very valid. You see an exponential decline in performance based on hours of lost sleep.
Yep. I feel like I read that. That's like, it starts at 100 milliseconds, right? It's something and it just goes to shit after that.
Yep, exactly.
Maybe we can kind of dig into just the physical and psychological symptoms of someone who's experiencing sleep debt. I think obviously if you're wearing Whoop, you can kind of start to see it accumulate. A lot of times folks actually can't perceive their own cognitive physical declines. So maybe start there with just maybe the literature on, do we even know if we have sleep debt? Like say we don't have access to a Whoop, we're not looking at our sleep architecture. How do we know that we're not getting sufficient sleep?
Sure, and I definitely think it's all related. So despite all these technologies we have now at our disposal to monitor and mitigate any amount of sleep debt and all the objective measures we have to look at sleep debt. I mean, we can even predict sleep debt now through neuroimaging. But despite all of that, the single one question that is still the most predictive factor of if somebody will have decrements in next day performance is if you ask somebody when they wake up in the morning, how well did you sleep? And based on their answer, it almost mirrors how they perform. So even if they got crappy sleep, like say they're an athlete competing in the CrossFit Games, they got crappy sleep the night before, but they kind of expect they're going to get crappy sleep. If they wake up and they're like, well, I slept okay given the circumstances, they are more likely to have their performance protected because the brain is a very adaptive organ and it will find a way to protect that individual because it is in the psychological state that I am ready to perform. Now, that's under a certain circumstance, though, when you're otherwise sleep satiated. So people who are chronically sleep deprived, that question actually would not hold true. But in a normal, healthy sleeper who's sleep satiated, that question would hold true.
So your mindset can move you around pretty significantly and protect you if you actually are functioning on lower sleep debt. And we definitely hear this anecdotally all the time, that I PR'd and I got 2 hours of sleep, or, some people actually literally cannot sleep at all, prior to a big competition. But I think to your point, if they have good sleep leading up to that night sleep in of itself is not going to impact next day performance, and they will be able to compensate with just, their mindset and just getting themselves into a place where they can compete. That's interesting. Do we know when we no longer have the ability to kind of tap into our mindset to kind of move that around? What is that point?
3 days. And we know this from quite a few studies. We know this from an endocrine perspective. If you look at the classic studies looking at drops in testosterone, with sleeping only 5 hours a night across a week. Day 3 is the tipping point. And we also know this from studies we've done at Walter Reed with cognition, that cognition continues to decline until sleep needs are met again. And that caffeine actually has zero protection against that decline by 3 days in. So we've studied this a lot of different ways, but 3 days of chronic sleep debt where you're basically losing about 60% of your total sleep amounts. So that's the thing. It's not going to be 5 hours for everyone. It's going to be 60% of your daily sleep need. By day 3 of only getting 60%, you're on a cataclysmic decline.
Wow. So people who are drinking caffeine and thinking they're basically just making bad decisions faster. Is that right?
Yeah, pretty much. Actually, funny enough, so in this study, it was published in the flagship journal of sleep. One of my colleagues published it, Dr. Tracy Jill Doty. She found that the caffeine group actually performs worse. So the people who are supplementing with caffeine on the same amount of sleep debt as somebody who wasn't supplementing on caffeine, they actually perform worse by post day 3 because they no longer have that protection of caffeine and they know it. So their mindset changes and they don't perform well again until they get sleep again.
To the points you're just making, we use caffeine to make up for lost sleep or to help us perform. Like, what is actually happening there? Because I think people think that that's a substitute for sleep in a lot of ways. So maybe take it from that angle and kind of talk about how that's not the case and how we need to reframe or rethink our relationship with caffeine.
That is the best question you have asked so far, because that's exactly what people think, is that you can replace sleep with caffeine. And as I said from that one study, that is not the case at all. So the reason why caffeine is effective is because it prevents the release of the neurochemical adenosine. So adenosine is a neurochemical that is released by glia cells that increases as you become more sleepy. And so throughout the day, from the moment you wake up until the moment you go to bed at night, you see a precipitous increase in adenosine. But what caffeine can do is it can block the rate at which adenosine is increasing. And so thereby it can minimize overall sleepiness if you adhere to a very specific caffeine dosing schedule, which we can get into later. But the problem is, even if caffeine is decreasing the slope of adenosine release, you still need to make sure that you replenish the system. And so caffeine cannot do that. The system has to be replenished through sleep. And the reason for that is because sleep is then when adenosine triphosphate, which is one of the main sources of adenosine, needs to be replenished. So all the basic cellular energy substrates of creatine, adenosine triphosphate, adenosine diphosphate, all that stuff that we need in order to stay alive and function only gets replenished with sleep, not with a supplement like caffeine.
I think we can say that, stimulants, when Whoop recovery is low, is not going to help you recover faster.
That's one of the things that we really have worked really hard at Walter Reed to sort of nail down, is this precise dosing of caffeine administration. We know that 200 milligrams is the maximum amount of caffeine you can handle at any given time. Anything else is more or less a ceiling effect. Beyond just 200 milligrams, you can only take 200 milligrams every 3 to 4 hours. So that's another thing you have to consider. It's not just the amount, it's the timing. And as long as you stop 6 to 8 hours before bed, you're fine, because the metabolism of caffeine, it does extremely vary by individual. And that's also genetically determined. But 6 to 8 hours is a good time frame where you could still get, sleep, even if you're supplementing with caffeine 3 or 4 different times throughout the day. I mean, I routinely do that, I have no issue sleeping at night.
We all metabolize caffeine a bit differently, so that, range is gonna change slightly from person to person, or vary from person to person. So you kind of have to play around with it and figure out, all right, look at your sleep onset latency, look at your, that kind of early bit of sleep, I think, to know whether or not it's actually impacting you. But I think too, like with folks with chronic sleep deprivation, caffeine is probably not gonna, when they go to put their head on the bed, even though they may have had caffeine at like 7 o'clock at night, like they're so exhausted, they're gonna fall asleep quickly. But maybe talk about the fragmentation that occurs, which just kind of further contributes to kind of this poor sleep cycle.
Yes, that's a great point, because I think that's one thing we don't talk about enough. And I was having a conversation yesterday with somebody about this, is like we care so much about sleep amount that we forget that actually one of the biggest culprits of poor sleep and the biggest contributors to all the health factors that result from poor sleep is sleep fragmentation. That is the key. Like all those people who have sleep disorders, it's not so much their lack of sleep, it's their inability to cycle effectively through sleep cycles, because they're constantly being woken up and can't complete a sleep cycle. And so caffeine can have a very similar impact. Is like, sure, you might be exhausted enough where you fall asleep, but you're still going to pretty much stay, because of the adenosine blockage, in the lighter stages of sleep and not reach the most deepest restorative stages of what we call non-REM slow wave sleep. Because actually the expression of slow wave sleep is dependent on adenosine circulation. And so when adenosine circulation is low, because it's inhibited by caffeine, you're not going to get slow wave sleep. But if adenosine circulation can be high, then you're going to get the restorative sleep, where you get the testosterone boost, the growth hormone boost, and all the physical restoration you need in order to function the next day.
Maybe I'm overstating this, but I know that some sleep researchers have almost, I think, claim a causal effect between kind of sleep deprivation and Alzheimer's, cognitive decline, and eventually Alzheimer's. Can you talk a little bit about maybe some of the research that exists around that and what's happening in the brain, when we're not activating kind of this sewage system?
Exactly. So the sewage system you're referring to, this process of waste clearance and regeneration of neuronal connections, is called the glymphatic system. And that's basically what it is. It's a sewage system for your brain. And during sleep, what happens is the glymphatic system, it's fluid-based. So during sleep, the vessels or the pipes of the sewage system are bigger than they are during wake. And if they don't have the opportunity to be bigger during sleep, then it decreases the flow and the flushing out of these wastes and toxins from your brain and your body. And so that's one of the key findings related to Alzheimer's, is because we find that Alzheimer's is a direct relationship with neurotoxic buildup of these plaques. And then also when you talk about, they're called neurofibrillary tangles, they result because of not having the ability of sleep to go through the repair processes. There's almost irreversible brain damage that results from this sleep deprivation, and this inability to clear these beta amyloid plaques because of reduced sleep.
Well, I don't want to terrify folks without giving them kind of tools and strategies. So we will get to tools and strategies.
Oh, I know.
I know it. But, I think that this is part of the public health education, right, is understanding the impact, of short sleep and insufficient sleep, low quality sleep, and, how that impacts our longevity. And maybe if we can just talk, in addition, we just talked about what's happening in the brain, but maybe just the linkages of sleep deprivation to things like cancer and, cardiovascular disease and obesity and, some of these other, kind of significant health problems, and knowing that root cause is insufficient sleep.
Sure. Well, we do know now that shift work is considered to be a level 2 carcinogen by the World Health Organization. We know on average now that shift work, which always results in insufficient sleep, takes about 10 to 15 years off your life and significantly increases your risk for cancer, especially if you're already at risk because of your family. And then same increased risk for metabolic and cardiometabolic disorders, with the reason being is because you miss out on these opportunities to repair the body. I mean, that's essentially what happens during sleep, is you have whole body and whole brain repair. The whole brain repair, a lot of that happens during REM sleep, but the whole body repair is like what the deep restorative sleep is for. And if you already have a sleep disorder, such as sleep apnea, well, you're never going to fully activate those repair processes because unless you're treated for sleep apnea, you're missing out on the ability to even enter those deep restorative stages of sleep because your body is waking you up well before that because you can't breathe.
You said before that it's kind of your sleep is going to start, the moment you wake up in the morning. And shift workers obviously aren't having the benefit of natural sunlight, and they're working during the night and sleeping during the day. Talk a little bit about what other cues can those folks anchor to help regulate the system and maybe mitigate the effects of not getting the light exposure that they need during the right times. Just that signaling isn't activating. So I would love to hear you talk about. We can maybe start to get into some tools now and start there.
Yeah. No, that is an excellent question. So I think the biggest thing with shift workers is knowing this information now, and a lot of companies I think are going down this road. They need to be disciplined, just like an athlete needs to be disciplined in their nutrition. A shift worker needs to be disciplined in their exposure to light. So that means when you're on shift, like try to minimize that crappy white light. A lot of companies now are investing in blue enriched light to just optimize and mimic natural sunlight exposure as much
Do not
as
wear
possible.
blue light blocker glasses when you need to be getting
Yes.
light. So when you want to be alert.
Exactly.
I don't know what happened
Yes.
to our world with the blue light blocking. I'm like, don't block the blue light when you want to
Yes,
be alert. When you want to be alert.
That is exactly it. You use those blue light blocking glasses when actually you're driving home from your shift in the morning,
yes.
and it is sun out and you have to wear shades. And like, yes, you have to maybe supplement with caffeine too, because that is somewhat dangerous, like, because they're already sleepy. But that's going to at least set them up for they can take like their first long nap and then do things in their day and then take an additional nap or get an additional sleep period with, again, blocking out the light. So they're basically on a reverse schedule of humanity where they have to pretend that when they're working, they're out like where I am now in South Florida, like exposed to sunlight all day. And then when the rest of the world is experiencing sunlight, they have to be vampires and block out the light as much as possible.
So the message to folks is when you want to be alert, you want to get as much blue light as possible. When you need to be sleepy, you want to try to block that light as much as possible. And that applies if you're, up during the day. That applies if you're, sleeping during the day. Like use that as a principle. And then maybe just talk as it relates to this, as we think about strategies to reduce chronic sleep debt and get folks kind of on a better path. Obviously the light behavior is massive, and that's a strategy and a tool. Maybe talk about, the other three core anchors. So obviously sleep-wake time being one of those really important anchors, how to think about that in the context of night shift. And we can just reverse that and apply that to other folks who are sleeping nocturnally. And then in exercise and maybe in meals too, because I think those are, these are the levers that people can pull to kind of mitigate the effects and really get themselves in a position where their body is primed to actually sleep and get the quality sleep that you're talking about.
Yes. I love the last one about exercise and meals because I have some differences of opinion based on what the current literature is.
Oh, gosh, I can't wait to hear it.
But I will talk about that after I talk about sleep and wake time.
Beautiful.
So the biggest thing to just getting restorative sleep is consistent sleep and wake time. So whether you're a shift worker or a day worker, sleep and wake time, the time you go to bed and the time you wake up needs to be consistent. And the reason for that is optimizing the circadian rhythms. So we have the biological clocks of the body. There's one in every single organ. I was fortunate enough to be a part of the team who discovered the one in the skeletal muscle. So even our skeletal muscle has a circadian clock that directly manipulates how quickly we get into restorative sleep. Sleep and wake time has to be consistent if you want restorative sleep. We know that from tons of literature in humans and mice and using genetic manipulation, like everything.
We've seen that too, just in the research that we're doing kind of internally, and the one that we did with the Army Alaska, very evident. We had 1,000 paratroopers, and we're I'm still working on analyzing all this data, but it was it was incredible to see the relationship between individuals who had stable sleep-wake time and their perception of control over their lives, their perception of just their own resilience. Sleep-wake time was just something that folks need to. It's just a behavior that. It obviously, as you're saying, affects every cell in the body, every clock in the body.
Yeah. And we have the opportunities now, like Whoop with the sleep coaching platform. It will tell you like, oh, you should start going to bed, like it's, there's really no excuse now because we all mostly have our phones. Even operators in austere environments, they still have their phones. And so the other thing is exercise and meals. Okay. So I've been fortunate enough to be a reviewer for a lot of the studies that have come out recently.
I feel like it's going to be epic right now. I'm like, I cannot wait to hear what you're going to say.
Well, it just goes to show like what happens when you stay in your foxhole and you don't cross collaborate with exercise physiologists.
Oh my, thank you for saying that. Yes. Yeah.
So, and I'm not an exercise physiologist, but I'm an athlete, and I've been an athlete my entire life. And I know if I work out too soon before I go to bed, like there's one time the Buttery Bros came to Fort Knox to film one of the open workouts. And like we did the open workout at like 9 at night. I did not sleep at all that night because I was just
wired. Yeah, I'm the same. I cannot work out at night. I really struggle. I'll lay in bed for hours.
And we know this from elite athletes like hockey players. Hockey players have a tremendously difficult time falling asleep. I've done a little bit of work with the Washington Capitals, and all of them, that is their biggest complaint as hockey players is I cannot fall asleep after a game.
My son plays ice hockey, and he's in high school. He's a freshman playing varsity, and like literally their ice hockey times are just they make me so angry. Like he doesn't get home until like 10:30. But what I did in his bathroom where he takes a shower is I put a super dim light in his shower. So like once he gets home, like lights are super dim. He goes in his bathroom, it's super dim. So that actually has helped him. I saw a big difference for him.
Awesome.
Yeah. But just when you're working with people like that people don't realize the impact of light when they get into their home environment and how that just either keeps you on that path to be alert or not. Any light into the retina is going to, tell your body to be awake. So yeah, that's had a huge impact, and he's been able to fall asleep much faster as a result.
That is so awesome. I'm going to give you credit, but like when I continue to work with the Capitals, I'm going to take it. So
tell them that they get their
they're going to win another Stanley Cup because of that. So no, just kidding.
Love it.
But okay, so the issue is I read these studies and they not a single study that says, exercise an hour before sleep doesn't actually impede sleep. Is because not a single study gets the rate of perceived exertion above 50%.
Yep.
And I'm like, there is your problem right there, is because even if they are untrained athletes, 50% is just like taking your dog for a walk before you go to bed.
Yep.
Like, you're never going to disrupt sleep because you never exceed 50%. And so, like, I have yet to see the dose response curve because I guarantee I don't have the money or the bandwidth to do it. But as soon as that one research does the dose response curve, you will see sleep disruption.
If they're looking to kind of have their system anchor to exercise, what would be your recommendation for individuals just generally?
So 3 to 4 hours before your bedtime. So the people who are doing like the late night CrossFit classes, like the 7 p.m. that finishes at 8, they're cutting it close, especially if their bedtime is around 10 or 10:30, because after they go to class, they're not going to bed. They're going to go home and eat, which can further disrupt their sleep because if they're eating things high in the glycemic index, that can delay their amount of time in restorative sleep.
Yep. So those blood sugar spikes, will end up fragmenting. So, and again, it might not impact sleep onset time, but they will show up in disturbances and to your point, time in these deeper stages.
Yep.
So meal timing, I know you think about intermittent fasting or time restricted feeding and how that relates to your circadian clock. How do folks who are working at night, or sleeping at night, how do we think about time restricted feeding? Kind of what are the best practices there in terms of really helping us fall asleep when we want to fall asleep and stay in deeper stages of sleep?
So I will say I'm not as much of an expert in like time restricted feeding and circadian rhythms. I do know there is a very close relationship, and intermittent fasting is one of those things that further makes the circadian clock be best to optimize. But I think the biggest takeaway is to make sure that if you are an athlete and you need to eat something before you go to bed because you don't want to wake up in the middle of the night starving, it's the worst feeling in the world. Like during CrossFit training season, worst feeling ever is to wake up hungry. But make sure you're sticking to a low glycemic food so that you don't have this sleep disruption or sleep fragmentation because of spikes in blood sugar.
So food that's bioavailable, high fat, yogurt, cottage cheese, which has a dual benefit of, being high in casein protein, which kind of you've seen in the research kind of helps with the recovery process. But we just don't want it. We don't want your body having to work hard to digest when you're trying to sleep. Both are parasympathetic activities. Your system is going to bias toward digestion, obviously, as opposed to sleep. So I think that we see this very, very clearly in the data, and we're just hypothesizing that that's kind of the dynamic or the phenomenon going on. And we actually have a big study with 5 different schools, 700 female athletes, and we're looking at pre-sleep feeding and how it impacts all sorts of factors that we, metrics that we track. So it's been interesting to kind of see some of those dynamics play out in that population.
Oh, that's awesome to hear, because that's exactly what we need is like, that's what I love about what you're doing, Kirsten, and like the whole Whoop team is like you're taking the big data approach and tapping into some of the hardest to reach demographics.
Yeah, with huge amounts of longitudinal data. It's been great. These are questions, that are related to human performance that, if we can get some answers to, we can just further drive these, optimal behaviors that are going to help us do the foundational things that, set us on a path to lead the richest, healthiest life, possible. And I think some of these things sound kind of trivial, like, oh, well, stopping eating, 3 to 4 hours before bed, like, what really I need to do that? But it is the difference between potentially living 5 to 10 years longer. It's actually, not trivial when you think about your lifespan. And I, don't want to be an alarmist or, kind of overreach here, but I think that these behaviors actually add up in a profound way and impact our system. And I think, back to our original point here on this theme is that if we can do some of these very simple things related to light, fueling, exercise timing, and sleep-wake timing, we set our system up to be just a more effective, efficient, system or machine, and, which then, protects us potentially from a lot of these disease states. So maybe let's just talk briefly about, maybe the top 3, strategies and tools folks can do during the day to either kind of make up for insufficient sleep or sleep debt. What are the things that they can do today that kind of mimic that? So, maybe naps, yoga nidra, breathing, we can kind of hit on your point of view on the top few.
Yeah. So number 1, napping. We have tons of data for that now in athletes, military, you name it. Napping is a wonderful thing. 2, if you can't nap, something like yoga nidra, this guided meditation practice to try to get some level of sleep. Like you might not hit the deeper stages like you do at napping, but you might hit the later stages. And so that is a means too. And then the last one, it seems counterintuitive. So it's more of a like short-term acute sympathetic activation. For long-term parasympathetic activation is heat exposure or cold exposure. I personally, so we did a small case study, small longitudinal case study with elite CrossFit athletes when I was at Emory doing my fellowship. And we actually found that cryotherapy, so that like 2-minute bolus of cold exposure actually has prolonged parasympathetic effects. And it actually increases self-reported sleep quality and also total sleep time independently of days of training, time of training, and it again, it was a small sample size, but it was longitudinal. So I think that's also a good thing too, is heat or cold exposure.
Yeah, I love that you said that. Like, I think there seems to be more and more studies coming out to support that. And in fact, I think there seems to be a protocol that validated in some recent research that came out in Cell in 2021, that basically says that about 12 minutes of cold exposure per week in 2 to 3 minute increments, 4 times a week is kind of the protocol. And they say, just be in the temperature is basically whatever you feel is like uncomfortable and you want to get out, just stay in there for a couple minutes, do that a few times a week, and you'll see improvements in sleep, and then there has a downstream effect to improving immunity. And I think given, while it's short-term sympathetic, it's, to your point, it's got this parasympathetic kind of longer-term effect that is super powerful in reducing or just making you more resilient and more robust. Well, let's see, we tapped naps, yoga nidra, maybe just breath work as kind of a final strategy or tool folks can engage in.
Yeah, so I have used the box method, and I've also used the Wim Hof technique. I really like the Wim Hof technique because there's a lot more evidence based for breath work now, but his work was kind of the first to like make it big time. I mean, his study ended up in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, so you can't do much better than that. But similar to cryotherapy, like the Wim Hof method, it's acute sympathetic activation for long-term parasympathetic responsiveness. The box method, as you know, like parasympathetic activation. But that's really what it comes down to is, whether or not something's going to keep you or prevent you from getting quality sleep or not getting quality sleep. It's the amount of sympathetic versus parasympathetic activation in the day. And if you could pair the two, then that's awesome. And breath work is a great way to like voluntarily induce parasympathetic activation.
Yeah, and I think, I say this over and over, to Whoop, I script for the rooftops every single day with my colleagues as we try to like develop features and give folks access to some of these tools inside our app. But, I think that they're understanding that we have way more control over our autonomic health than we think we do. And I think at the end of the day, I think our mission at Whoop is to help people understand their physiology, help them take control of their body in a way that gives them, agency over their health. And I think one of the things that people can use the Whoop app for is just literally understanding, okay, I might not have the sleep that I need that night. That means I'm going to be inherently more activated today. Like my cortisol levels are going to be higher. I'm going to be, my system is not going to be working as effectively, but I can mitigate the effect of that with my breath work, with yoga nidra, with potentially taking a nap. Like I can offset the deleterious effects of maybe not getting the sleep that I need and actually build a healthier lifestyle that will actually help me get the sleep that I need in the future. Start to unwind maybe some of these vicious, negative cycles that occur when we're not getting enough sleep. And taking control of the behaviors when you're awake is, to me, the shortest path to kind of helping improve your sleep at night.
100%.
All right, let's talk a little bit about culture. Despite, I think, a lot of education around sleep, and I think people are intellectually, rationally understand, wow, I need to spend more time in bed. But maybe just talk about the rise of sleep debt. We see this in the data and its broader implications on society and culture. And, what are some strategies or ways that leaders can think about their organization to really try to shift this mindset and mentality?
So I think the biggest thing with leaders is presenting them with the objective data to show otherwise, that like prioritizing people's time for sleep, not just at home, but napping at work is the way to go. We actually had that. I love telling this story in the Army. We had that big success because I obviously work for the most anti-sleep promoting organization of them all. Like, it's better now, but it's still bad. And so a few years ago, we wanted to get sleeping pods at Walter Reed for the residents and the night shift workers. And at first, it was like met with the ultimate amount of criticism. So much so that, and I'm actually surprised I still have a job because of this, is we took anonymous quotes from senior leaders that said, They didn't want soldiers napping on the job. If they did, that meant they were lazy. Only lazy people have time for naps. And so we took those quotes and we put evidence refuting those quotes and published it in the flagship journal of sleep as a letter to the editor.
That's bold.
And sure enough now, Walter Reed has napping pods.
Oh, that is just such a success story.
Unfortunately, you have to be... I know that's actually my job in the Army is I'm the person that I think senior leaders hate because I tell them, no, sleep is important. And I, prevent them from doing more. But that's exactly what society needs is we need this cultural shift towards sleep.
Allison, thank you so much for all your time today. I think this has been, an incredible discussion, and it's just been an honor to kind of be able to ask you questions and tap into all of your expertise across these domains. And thank you for your being a part of our Women's Performance Collective as well. I think there's going to be an opportunity to do some really cool research with that group just around women's health and reproductive health and kind of that spectrum. So excited to kind of tap you for some of that work as well.
Oh yeah, you are doing incredible work personally.
Appreciate that so much. Yeah, we're excited about it, and but it's only possible with collaborators like yourself and honestly the foundational work that you've done in this space. Frankly, as it relates to sleep, has really inspired a lot of the ways we think about our data sets and what we can kind of look into more deeply, and just so appreciative. So thank you.
Thank you to Dr. Brager and Kristen for coming on the Whoop podcast. If you enjoyed it, please don't forget to subscribe, leave us a rating. Don't forget you can use the code WILL, WILL, get 15% off a Whoop membership. Check us out on social at Whoop, at Will Ahmed. Wishing you a very green week. We'll be back next week. Stay healthy, stay in the green.